Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of How Stories Work. Today, I want to go over the meaning of an ending in a holistic story. Subtext in the dramatic theory of stories splits story structure into two different categories: the stories that organize structure through reason or a linear cause and effect mindset, and stories that organize through relationship through a holistic mindset. The way you can see the difference between the two is when you come into Premise Builder and you come down here to the bottom and you see the subtext settings. You'll see this at the very beginning. What organizes the structure of this premise? In a previous video, I went over the four endings of a linear mindset story, which is all about cause and effect. If you do this, then you get that. If you don't do this, then you don't get that. A holistic story is a little bit different in that it's not really interested in cause and effect, and it's not really about problem solving. It's more about the balance between things and managing those balances to set things off in a different direction. So instead of a goal, you might have an intention. Instead of a consequence, you have feelings of overwhelm. As a result of this shift away from goal and consequence to something closer to intention and overwhelm, the meaning of an ending in a holistic story will be much different. In a linear story, you have triumphs, stories of virtue, bleak stories, and tragedies. But when you switch it to a holistic story structure, and now you organize your story around relationships, those same dynamics have a different feel to them. These four different endings are based on the work I did several years ago about the holistic premise. These series of articles go through each and every one of these endings with tons of examples, and I'll leave a link to this in the notes below. But the general idea is that the original dramatic theory of story was very heavily geared towards problem solving in a linear mindset. That's why you will find terms like problem and solution, goal and consequence. But as I worked with writers and developed subtext, it became really clear to me that there was at least 50% of the population who was not being served by a better understanding of what it means to structure your story holistically and around relationships. The one caveat I should add is many writers, when they're introduced to this concept, automatically think that holistic is more sophisticated than linear and that they should write a holistic story. You can see that here over in the premise. It's much more sophisticated. All these premises are going to be a lot longer than the linear ones. This video will likely be longer than the linear one, but that doesn't mean that the holistic story is any better than the linear story. Just means it's very different. And if you are not connecting emotionally and intuitively with this premise here in the upper right, when you click holistic, there's nothing wrong with sticking with linear. In fact, you might find that you make your life a lot easier when you choose linear. I can tell you, as the sole developer of subtext, it took months and actually several years to get these holistic premises to read right. It's much easier to do linear cause and effect when you're programming something. You have a problem, you have a solution, you have a goal. If this happens, then this happens. Trying to encapsulate that same feeling programmatically into something that can serve everyone was quite a chore and is always in active development. These premises might be a little bit different by the time that you actually start working with subtext. I'm always tweaking them, always improving them to better serve writers who want to write these holistic stories. So in honor of the release of the latest Matrix, which was a major milestone in terms of a holistic mindset story, most science fiction films up until then were always linear cause and effect, like Star Wars, Star Trek. The Matrix, the reason why it was so different was that it was structured around relationships and that there wasn't a goal, there wasn't a goal and consequence, that it was really about Neo learning how to balance the inequities that he felt in his life. And so that's what we're going to do today. Down here at the bottom, you'll see composure, present, stagnant, and disconnect. The first two are very similar. And in fact, it can be difficult to differentiate between the two. But if you take the example of the first matrix and you look at composure, and then you compare that to the present, there is a very sophisticated difference between just opening yourself up to some new balance in your life that can help manage the issues that you face. And that allows you to become more present. So you're opening up to that. And that would be this idea of a failure good story. When it comes to holistic stories, holistic minds are not really concerned with success or failure because everything's a success, everything's a failure. It's not an on off switch. The difference is, are you opening yourself up and allowing this new element to come in and manage these issues? Or is there a sense of composure? And I like to think of this as the visualization of Neo at the end, where he stops all the bullets and he breathes in and breathes out and everything goes like this. That is a composed ending. And it's not just the main character, though holistic stories always focus on really strong main character through lines, because the holistic mindset is really self-focused. It's very self-aware. It's not so concerned with the external as much as it's trying to find a way to balance the internal with the external in a practical sense for a story that just means the main character through line is really played out. Here in Composure, you'll see address this certain issue here. The default now is self-interest by balancing your overwhelming avoidance with your pursuit. Like in the linear story where the default was get rid of avoidance and then you can obtain something. If you get rid of this, you'll solve this goal. In a holistic story, you're no longer concerned with the goal or the consequence of the story. You're concerned with the issues because that's where you find the balance. It's more of a sliding scale than an on-off switch. That's why the premise here gets rid of the goal or gets rid of the consequence and instead focuses on the objective story issue as that main connective tissue between character and plot. If you think of plot as the external world of the storyline, then the main character is the internal world of the storyline, you can start to see how the holistic balances. And then we still have that same element of a void, but then it's being balanced out by the dynamic pair, which would have been the solution in the linear story. Now you just have those two balances between each other. If you can bring that balance up to a place that almost makes it equal. So if you're always running away from something, but then you do go after something, if you can bring that into balance, like Neo does at the end of The Matrix, then you have an overall feeling of composure. And there's this nice feeling of completeness with your story. If instead you're approaching that, but you haven't quite reached it, but you're opening yourself up to it, that's when you'd want to go with the present ending. So opening yourself up to that avoidance manages your self-interest while sending you down the path of becoming more present. Another interesting thing that happens is there is a difference between those stories that argue balance and those stories that argue growth. Again, compared to the linear structured story, you'll notice that the argument of the premise here has two choices between abandoning something or maintaining something. Since you're not getting rid of something in a relationship, holistic mindset story, when you click relationships, this changes. It still has the same underlying story dynamics of changed and steadfast, but the argument of the premise is either an argument for balance or an argument for growth. And if you notice these first two, you have composure and present. If I then switch over to growth, now this first one is no longer composure, because it wouldn't make logical sense for growth to mix with composure. Instead, if you're in this stage of growing and you're moving towards something, then you can transcend. And it's almost like elevating you out of whatever sort of issues or circumstances you find yourself in. The difference here then is in the balance, you address an issue by balancing two separate elements, a pair of elements. In the growth one, you transcend by engaging in an element that distorts those issues, but then helps you heal and transcend. And by distorting, there is some harmonic frequency that's going on that kind of jumbles it up or frees any sort of resistance and allows some flow to come through so that you can heal and transcend your way up and out of those present circumstances. And those are the only two that change. The difference between transcending and being present is really minor. The only difference between present and transcend is one keeps you present and one heals and transcends. And if you can't tell the difference, you'll be happy to know that the actual structure of the story, what actually gets built out, is virtually identical. The dramatic theory of story is really strong when it comes to linear structured stories, and it gets really close to approximate the holistic. It's biased towards linear because it's programmed and there are if-then statements. The holistic comes really close, but you'll find that the linear story forms are a lot more accurate. The holistic ones are a little bit less accurate, but they have the right feeling. So don't feel like you have to nail every single story point and every single story beat in a holistic story, especially if you're looking at growth, because in growth, transcending something and being present are going to turn out to be almost exactly the same. They'll only show a slight difference in your illustrations and your storytelling, not so much the structure, because it's more of a dynamic thing. Currently, subtext in the dramatic theory of story emphasize structure over dynamics. Returning back to the balanced argument premise or the changed main character resolve, we still have stagnant and disconnect stories to talk about. To a holistic, growth is everything, transformation is everything. If you're not changing, you're dying. Because the holistic mindset is completely concerned with relationships, and relationships are always changing. If that relationship is not changing, and instead it's remaining stagnant, then you know you have some issues going on and you're going to have to address them in a different way. In the premise, we have the issue of the self-interest in the outside world. When you engage in that, in order to either avoid or run away from something, it'll keep you from growing, leaving you feeling stuck and unfulfilled. These kind of stories are the holistic, recognizing that trying to manage an external issue with a current internal approach will keep you from growing, and it'll just leave you stuck and ultimately unfulfilled. It's not going to be completely terrible, but it's just going to have this resonance of this is not feeling good. It's feeling bad. The second half of these endings, the good and the bad, the judgment, are everything to the holistic, whereas the success failure is not as important. And the very worst thing that can ever happen to a holistic mindset is this feeling of disconnection from the outside world. So when you feel disconnected from everything around you, because if you are managing your life through relationships and you can't make those connections, to the linear, it's a tragedy. And to a holistic, disconnection is complete tragedy. The premise here, allowing the uncertainty of becoming something into your experience disconnects you from the outside world, clouding your avoidance with shades of pursuit. This is very sophisticated and a very complex premise and could possibly not be something that you connect with. But to a lot of holistic minds, they understand this idea of being uncertain because they can't connect themselves. They don't know where they sit in the world, which draws up this feeling of uncertainty and disconnects them from the outside world, clouding those motivations towards avoidance, towards running away with pursuit and not really sure where to go, and just this overall feeling of needing to disconnect from society and pull away. In an effort to make that disconnection feel even stronger, I've added in the consequence in here, as opposed to the issues that you'll find in the other three holistic endings for a story. A holistic can understand linear, but it just thinks it's so simple. The on-off switch version makes that disconnection or that uncertainty even greater because life can't be that simple. That's why I switched that. If you look at the Composure one, it has that objective story plot thematic issue in there, as opposed to the disconnect has the objective story consequence. So this is where you get that feeling of being overwhelmed. That's what it would be like for the holistic mind to engage in the consequence. One more thing I should have mentioned at the beginning is you'll notice this question changes as well. In the linear, it says, what kind of ending does the story have? And in the relationship one, it says, what direction does the story take? Again, it's not a goal. There isn't something that's reached at the end, but rather an intention. And if you look at the end of something like The Matrix, Neo doesn't blow up the Death Star and everything's great and he comes home and gets a medal. Instead, he goes to the phone booth and he says, hey, I'm a little cooler now and I'm going to tell all these people what's going on. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I haven't solved a goal, but I know that I'm headed in a different direction, and just know that things are going to change. And to the holistic mindset, change is everything. So that's it for how stories work. If you have any questions about this or the holistic mindset, please let me know below, and I will see you next time.